Hello and welcome to Aftermath, Mirror Fighting's review of, well, I guess it was technically last night's fights. Normally we do this on a Sunday morning. I'm going to do it in the immediate aftermath of Joe Joyce's victory over Daniel Dubois. Not a shock necessarily, but certainly a surprise. In terms of the odds, Daniel Dubois started odds-on favourite to win the fight. Very few people picked against him, despite the fact that really when the fight was initially made way back in February, before all the pandemic, it was very much a 50-50 fight. But Daniel Dubois was the one who had his supporters going into the fight. But I said it this morning or yesterday morning on Boxing Tonight, that Dubois had the questions to answer. For me, he was the one who, just hadn't really experienced enough in the ring as a professional. Very short senior amateur career as well. And then really he'd just blown through all of his opponents. The only one he couldn't see off was Kevin Johnson. Now, fair enough, very few people tend to stop Kevin Johnson, even in his latter years. But it still suggested that Daniel Dubois, well, there were two ways of looking at it. Either he didn't have enough tools in his bag to find different ways to win, or it was simply that he just really hadn't been extended to the point where he felt he had to use them. And even maybe against Kevin Johnson, he was just happy just to see it out and to go for the points win. Whereas with Joe Joyce, okay, he'd had fewer professional fights, but he had a longer amateur career. And then as a professional, he'd fought the tougher fights. Now, I know Bermane Stiverne, I know Bryant Jennings were not in their prime. They were not peak. They were coming over, not necessarily as opponents, just to be beaten, but you could see that they weren't quite where they were a few years ago. And, Joyce was never really tested against either of them, and, went through the gears and come to victories. But ultimately, in those kind of fights, you're always going to be tested, against guys who have been there and done it and who've got the little tricks and the different things they can try. And it's such a common phrase and such a phrase that's used a lot, a learning fight. But these are all much better learning fights than Daniel Dubois ever had when he, was just blowing people away. So I haven't even said how the fight was won yet, but Joe Joyce did stop Daniel Dubois in the 10th round. A very strange, not a strange stoppage, but not if you're reading that the fight was stopped in the 10th round, you probably assume that Joyce had just sort of landed blow after blow and kind of overwhelmed Dubois, but it wasn't like that. Dubois' left eye had by this point swollen shut. Joyce landed on it 36 seconds, I think, into the 10th round. Dubois took a knee, and then as the referee, Ian John Lewis, got to 10, he kind of started to get up a little bit, but in that way that fighters do when they just don't really want to get up, but they also don't want to still be on their knee by the time it's waved off. So he was kind of, sort of just starting to come up. But the fight was waved off. Joyce, still after 10 rounds or 9 and a bit rounds, had enough energy to do his traditional somersault celebration. And it was an intriguing fight. I mean, was it a thrilling fight? No, but it doesn't mean it wasn't an exciting fight. It was, as I said, it was intriguing. It was nip and tuck. I had Joyce 5-4 up on my card going into that 10th round. Quite a few people, including David Hay and Carl Frampton in the studio, had Dubois 5-4 up. So it was very, very nip and tuck. Joyce clearly, particularly with Dubois' eye closing as it was probably going to have the edge going into rounds 10, 11, and 12. Not to mention the fact that Dubois had never been in that position. So the fight was probably playing into Joe Joyce's hands by that point. Until then, Joyce started the first round very, very much on the front foot. His jab was far better, I think, than we expected it to be. Some people thought Dubois, if he wasn't able to put Joyce away, might actually just jab his way to a points victory, in fact. But really, Joe Joyce's jab was on point, although Daniel Dubois did come out much quicker in the second round. And he was the only one, he was the one of the two of them who landed the better shots with his right hand. Joyce was very jab happy, but I mean, why not? You don't, Dubois' eye was marked up after 2 or 3 rounds and then really started to sort of close as they reached the halfway point. So why not stick with the shot that was making was giving you so much success up till that point? But just it's a shame there was no crowd, but it was a tremendous nip and tuck, intense fight that you couldn't take your eye off. Even though neither man was ever really in trouble, Joe Joyce, as well as having, he must be the calmest man, certainly in boxing, maybe in the world. He is just so collected. Just nothing seems to ever frustrate him or fluster him. And I guess that can kind of sometimes give the impression that he's just not bothered or doesn't really care. But in the ring, it must be so useful. And so his temperament is fantastic. For a big occasion, even without the crowd, he'll have known how big an occasion this was. A really, for him especially, given that he's 35, huge crossroads fight. And if it had gone badly wrong, I could be sitting here saying, is this the end for Joe Joyce? But so he has his cool temperament, never looked flustered. Not that Dubois ever put him under huge amounts of pressure to see just how Joyce would cope with it, but he had his temperament, had that jab, and his chin, again, must have one of the toughest chins in boxing. And the right hands that Dubois did land pretty much just bounced off. And we've seen what damage they can do in the past. All the superlatives have been thrown at Daniel Dubois' right hand. But in this case, Joyce looked pretty unmoved by the whole thing. The question really that was asked immediately afterwards, did Daniel Dubois quit? Now, it's such a loaded word. I think that's the problem. If you accuse someone of quitting, are you accusing them of being a coward or whatever? And obviously that's not the case. But in the sense that he stayed on his knee, as I say, until the very last moment, by which point he was never going to beat the count, then he did quit. He chose to take the knee as well. Like, it wasn't as if Joyce landed that left hand. It wasn't necessarily following up. It wasn't under pressure. But down went Dubois, took the knee, and there was the only physical reason for him not to get up was his eye. There was nothing. It wasn't like he couldn't get up. It wasn't like he was dazed or anything like that. So, as Carl Frampton on the punditry said, call a spade. He did essentially quit, albeit, as I said, that's a loaded word, and maybe we shouldn't band it around too easily. But it's such a turn up for the books. Daniel Dubois, really the golden, certainly Frank Warren's golden goose, the next heavyweight star, a decade ahead of us of success, of following in the footsteps of Anthony Joshua, Tyson Fury, maybe our next British heavyweight world champion. That's not necessarily derailed for good, but certainly for the time being. And then now whole questions have to be asked about his whole professional career. Did he have the right fights? Was it built up properly? Was he thrown in at the deep end? And the way he quit, what does that say about him going forward? Frank Warren sort of checked himself, but initially he said, if he continues as in his career, and then said, well, no, of course he will continue, and I'm sure he will, but for a young man to have suffered a defeat like that, to have gone out the way he did, I'm sure he will have plenty of contemplative days and weeks ahead as he considers what's next. For Joe Joyce, as I said, he's 35. This, to be fair to him, he has been built better and properly, if you like, thus far. So, there's no expectation that he will take any sort of a step backwards. If he inherits Daniel Dubois' spot in the WBO rankings at number 2, then it's him and Alexander Usyk for the world title, should Anthony Joshua vacate in a couple of weeks, probably, after his fight with Kubrat Pulev. I can't imagine Joe Joyce will say no to that fight. It just comes down to, as long as Joshua vacates, of course, and then B, whether that fight can be made without fans, where it can be made, etc., etc. You know, I'd like to think actually it probably would be on pay-per-view, but really that would be, I can't imagine, it certainly wouldn't sell. Joe Joyce, a very quiet man, very reserved. Alexander Usyk doesn't really speak English, so difficult to build that fight. So, you know, some financial details need to be ironed out. But certainly that looks like the next fight for Joe Joyce, and certainly he goes onwards, and at some point will certainly fight for a world title. Daniel Dubois faces a rebuilding job, but plenty of fighters have done it before. David Haye was, as I said, was on punditry duty, and he talked about it. He lost to Carl Thompson, of course, and went on to become a 2-weight world champion. So far from game over, but perhaps certainly a lot of questions to be asked. But for Joe Joyce, more somersaulting to come. Well, that's all for this quick recap. There's, of course, another heavyweight fight tonight. Mike Tyson against Roy Jones Jr. We'll have a full coverage of that on Mirror Fighting, as well as a recap tomorrow. Then on Monday, I'll look back with George Groves and Declan Taylor in far more detail at Joe Joyce's victory over Daniel Dubois. Please do give the video a thumbs up. Please do subscribe to our channel. And please do join us again soon.